It's a power-packed Thursday, lots of action in the Indian capital, New Delhi. Leaders from 40 countries are in town for the G20 foreign ministers' meeting. On the sidelines, India spoke to China, Russia and the US, among others. This is being called the golden moment of Indian diplomacy. To lead a grouping that first came into existence after the Asian economic crisis 25 years ago, can India steer the world out of another crisis though? The war in Ukraine is only intensifying. Despite Prime Minister Modi's appeals, the divisions in G20 prevailed today. There was no joint statement and no family photo. And yet, it's a moment of triumph. We'll bring you a special report, the backstory of India's big moment. Also on the show, after a zillion conspiracy theories, the US says there was no foreign hand in the Havana syndrome. In the UK, millions of children are going hungry. And in Romania, the Prime Minister has a new advisor, an AI bot called Iron. We'll bring you these stories and more. First, the headlines. India's Supreme Court orders a probe on the Adani case. The company's stocks had crashed after American group Hindenburg accused it of short selling. Adani has welcomed the probe. He says truth will prevail. Another important order from the top court today. It says a panel should appoint India's Chief Election Commissioner, a panel that has the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition and the Chief Justice of India. Until now, the Prime Minister recommended a name to the President. In Ukraine, the battle for Bakhmut reaches a critical stage. Kiev says its forces are hanging on to their positions amid relentless attacks from Russia. If Moscow captures Bakhmut, it will be its first major win in Ukraine in 6 months. Fresh tensions over Taiwan. China steps up incursions in the Taiwanese airspace. America gives weapons worth $619 million to Taipei. This includes missiles for the F-16 fighter jets. And 3 cheers for Germany. It has announced a new feminist foreign policy. This is to erase discrimination. Berlin will lobby to ensure women's concerns are more in focus and women are better represented. India is the hub of global diplomacy. As G20 president, India is hosting the foreign ministers of the G20, the top diplomats of the world's 20 biggest economies. Some of them are allies, others arch rivals. The day began with handshakes. Let me show you some pictures. These are the foreign ministers of the US, Russia and China. They're all in Delhi shaking hands with their Indian counterpart, Dr. S. Jaishankar. They're at war in Ukraine, but attending talks in India. It is a big deal. Prime Minister Modi made a personal appeal for consensus today, but it fell on deaf ears, it seems. There is no consensus. Russia and America came face to face. They talked at each other. So after a long day of hard diplomacy, you can say the results were mixed. In the next few minutes, we'll try to sum it up for you. Let's start with the foreign ministers' meeting. It's the second event under India's G20 presidency, and the scale of this was truly massive. This was one of the largest gatherings of G20 foreign ministers. In all, as many as 40 delegations were invited. You had the foreign ministers of the G20, which is the first half. But who were the second half, the other 20? With its presidency, India is trying to give a voice to the underrepresented. Leaders from ASEAN nations were invited for this event. Some of India's immediate neighbors like Bangladesh were invited, also Mauritius. The G20 is also giving the hospitality sector in India a minor boost. All 5-star hotels in central Delhi are fully booked this week. Now let's talk about what happened at the meetings. The first event was in Bengaluru, the finance ministers' meeting. It happened last month. It ended without a consensus, no joint statement. What about the meeting in New Delhi, the foreign ministers' meeting? The result was the same. There was no joint statement today.
There were issues, and I think the issues, I would say, very frankly, concerned the Ukraine conflict, on which there were divergences. So on the bulk of the issues, we were able to get an outcome document. There was a chair summary because there were differences on the Ukraine issue which we could not reconcile between various parties who held differing positions.
The meeting was presided over by India's External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar. He began the proceedings by observing a minute's silence. This was for the victims of the devastating earthquakes in Turkey and Syria. Then Prime Minister Modi made a speech. He spoke candidly. He said, multilateralism is in crisis. And the global governance system has failed on two important fronts. Number one, preventing global wars, and number two, international cooperation. The Prime Minister also brought up the global South. He said India's presidency is giving a voice to it. In the end, he made an appeal. He asked the G20 foreign ministers to set aside their differences and build consensus on common goals.
You are meeting at a time of deep global divisions. As foreign minister, it is but natural that your discussions are affected by the geopolitical tensions of the day. We all have our positions and our perspectives on how this tension should be resolved. However, as the leading economies of the world, we also have a responsibility toward those who are not in this room. The world looks upon the G20 to ease the challenges of growth, development, economic resilience, disaster resilience, financial stability, transnational crime, corruption, terrorism, and food and energy security.
Prime Minister Modi's approach has won him praises. The Italian Prime Minister is in town too. Giorgia Meloni said Prime Minister Narendra Modi of India is the most loved leader.
I firmly believe that there's a lot that we can do together, and I'm not sure if this will lead me to the approval rate that the Prime Minister Modi has reached. I think he's the most loved one of all around the world. But I mean, this has really proven that he has been a major leader, and congratulations for that, Prime Minister.
Now, as G20 president, India has set out clear priorities. The focus is on the developing world and its urgent needs like dealing with climate change, the increasing burden of debt, digital transformation, rising inflation, and food and energy security. These issues impact every government and their citizens. Surely the G20 could have done to build consensus here, but the war in Ukraine has come in the way. The G20 is not being able to look beyond the conflict. Sample this. There was no family photo of the G20 meeting. A family photo is when all the leaders attending the meeting come together for a click. But leaders of the G7, the US, the UK, Canada, France, Germany, Italy and Japan were not on board. They do not want to share the frame with the Russians, so no photo. And this is the second time they're doing this. There was no family photo in the Bali meet last year either. Many ministers did not make it for the inaugural dinner yesterday, apparently in an attempt to limit their engagements with Russia. So the war in Ukraine will cast a shadow on these events. Today, the top diplomats of the US and Russia were in the same room for the first time in almost a year. The daggers were drawn. America's Blinken tried to rally more support for Ukraine. Russia's Lavrov tried to mount a counterattack.
End this war of aggression. Engage in meaningful diplomacy that can produce a just and durable peace. President Zelensky has put forward a 10-point plan for a just and durable peace. The United States stand ready to support Ukraine through diplomacy to end the war on this basis. President Putin, however, has demonstrated zero interest in engaging, saying there's nothing to even talk about unless and until Ukraine accepts, and I quote, the new territorial realities.
By posing, making a lot of rhetorical statements, they wanted to put at the forefront the problem, the situation around Ukraine, which they present under the guise of the so-called Russian aggression. It did not yield anything good. The discussion, at least in regards of the Western countries' speeches, the G7 countries, they were getting very emotional in their statements, and it all was damaging the normal process of discussing the issues that are really important for the G20 agenda.
Their fight continued behind the cameras too. Reports say Blinken and Lavrov met each other. It wasn't a scheduled interaction. The leaders spoke briefly to each other. This is their first one-on-one interaction since the war in Ukraine began. And what was discussed? Blinken is said to have made 3 points to Lavrov. Number one, the US will continue to support Ukraine. Number two, Russia should rejoin the New START treaty, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START. It's a pact about nuclear weapons. The US and Russia are both signatories. They have the biggest nuclear arsenal in the world. The treaty is designed to restrict deployment of nukes by each side, but last month, Russian President Putin decided to suspend his country's participation. Blinken told Lavrov that Russia should join again. And his third message was this: the US wants Russia to release Paul Whelan. He's an American citizen imprisoned in Russia. He's an American Marine. He faces charges of spying. He was arrested in 2018 and is currently serving a 16-year jail sentence. This was America's message. 3 points. What about Russia? What did Lavrov say? What was his reaction? The Russian foreign minister was scathing in his attacks. He accused Western diplomats of derailing the meeting in an effort to scapegoat Russia. Lavrov presented his criticism in the form of an apology to India. Allow me to quote from what he said. I want to apologize to the Indian presidency and to our colleagues from countries of the global south for the obscene behavior of some Western delegations, which have turned the G20's agenda into a farce. You see, India's goals for the G20 presidency are ambitious. Considering the differences, the task for the Indian diplomats is cut out. The war in Ukraine could derail India's agenda. Our next story is inspired by a social media trend, how it started and how it's going. I'm sure you've seen memes and stories on these lines. Tonight, we'll tell you the story of India's diplomacy, how it started and how it's going. When India became independent, it had neither a strong military nor a robust economy. But we had our civilizational wealth and values. And on the strength of these, we made partners and friends. Today, 7 decades after independence, in a period that's been called the Amrit Kal, we are seeing the golden moment of Indian diplomacy. It presents both a challenge and an opportunity. Top leaders from 40 countries are in India as we speak. And tonight, I'll focus on 3 of them. The foreign ministers of Russia, China, and America. 3 world powers, enemies and frenemies, coming together in India. Let's start with China, India's immediate neighbor and perpetual problem. India was among the first countries to recognize China. Nehru visited China twice before India's independence. Under him, Delhi supported Beijing's bid for permanent membership at the United Nations Security Council. China repaid this with hostility and war. Throughout their history, India and China have never been strategic partners. They have partnered with Moscow and Washington at different periods in time, but never with each other. They share a border which is disputed, a power asymmetry that complicates their relationship, and a perception of each other that does not really lend to trust. India sees China as unreliable. China has long held a racist view of India. They called India the yellow sick man at one point. Now add Pakistan to the mix, and it becomes an almost irreconcilable equation. Yet India is welcoming the Chinese foreign minister and holding talks in the spirit of diplomacy. Because often, making a conversation takes more courage than fighting a war. Then we come to America, a country that began the relationship with India on a note of distrust. India was not a camp follower in the Cold War, and the US could not stomach it. When India fought Pakistan to liberate Bangladesh in 1971, US President Nixon urged China to quote-unquote scare those goddamn Indians to death. That's what he said. They sent their 7th Fleet, led by an aircraft carrier, to the Bay of Bengal to threaten India. Washington punished India for its independent foreign policy. It cancelled World Bank loans. It blocked the transfer of military spare parts. It sanctioned India's space program. For the longest time, America gave a clean chit to Pakistan's nuclear program but imposed sanctions on India. It tried to force unequal treaties like the NPT on India. And it kept arming Pakistan to keep India in check. It was a deeply flawed policy that Washington is still in the process of fixing. But today, America calls India a strategic partner. The two sides have come a long way. Yes, global developments have played a role, but these images are the fruits of persistent Indian diplomacy. Third on our list is Russia, an old and trusted partner of India, albeit with challenges of its own. When the UK, the US and China backed Pakistan in 1971, Moscow stood up for India. It sent cruisers and destroyers and nuclear submarines. When the Soviet Union entered Afghanistan in 1979, India did not condemn it. But New Delhi told Moscow it doesn't appreciate the intervention. When the world refused to share rocket technology with India, the Soviets stepped up. When the West tried to meddle in Kashmir, Moscow backed India. And now when Russia is being treated as a pariah, India is buying oil from it, and India is hosting its foreign minister along with other world leaders. And this is being done despite immense pressure from India's other partners. This, we say, is the triumph of diplomacy. To have under the same roof leaders of countries that are at war with each other, this in itself is an achievement. Beyond the headlines, can India hammer a consensus? Can it really take the world closer to peace? It is in the best place to try, we say. And consensus or not, this congregation is an achievement in itself. And while the G20 can't get over the war, the Americans are working on another front, fighting China. Apparently, the US is now convinced that it has a quote-unquote existential struggle with China. So in a rare show of unity, Democrats and Republicans are coming together to fight the dragon. Washington is also working on what's being called an anti-China coalition. It is threatening Beijing against giving weapons to Moscow. But America itself is sending more weapons to Taiwan. And of course, it has started talking a lot more about the Wuhan virus leaking from a Chinese lab. So connect the dots and you'll see how the US is preparing to fight China on multiple fronts. We'll start with what US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said about China this week.
We've been watching it very carefully from day one. And the reason that I raised this not only with Wang Yi last week, but also publicly, along with other colleagues in the administration, is because of concern we have based on information that we have that China is considering moving beyond the non-lethal support that some of its companies have been providing to actually lethal material support for Russia's war effort in Ukraine. And what I can share with you is that we did very clearly warn China about the implications and consequences of going through with providing such support. We will not hesitate, for example, to target Chinese companies or individuals that violate our sanctions or otherwise engage in supporting the Russian war effort.
An open threat to China. If it gives lethal aid to Russia, it will suffer consequences. That's what Blinken said. And now his government is walking the talk. The US is talking to its close allies about sanctioning China. It has reached out to members of the G7, the group of 7 countries, the world's top 7 economies, minus China, of course. Washington is exploring sanctions on China, but it's not going to be easy because China is not Russia. Countries around the world, including in the West, have business interests with China. They may not be ready to fight it. In fact, one of them says there isn't enough intel about China providing support to Russia. The US, on its part, says it is constantly providing all relevant intelligence to its allies. And therein lies the crack in America's embryonic alliance against China. Nonetheless, Washington is exploring the possibility of sanctions. And while it prohibits China from giving weapons to Russia, the US itself continues to give more weapons to Taiwan. Of course, they can justify it, but the contrast is obvious. The US has approved a $619 million arms sale to Taiwan. This includes missiles for Taiwan's F-16 fighter jets. They're talking about hundreds of missiles and $619 million, figures that China won't like. And there's more. On Tuesday, the House Foreign Affairs Committee passed 8 bills. What do these bills do? They either support Taiwan or they counter China. Either way, they hurt China's interests and ambitions. And from Beijing's perspective, Washington is being hypocritical. If the US can arm Taiwan, why can't China arm Russia? That's their question. And China isn't as polite as the US when it comes to issuing threats.
We urge the US to pull back before it's too late, stop stepping on the edge, taking salami tactics, and breaking through red lines over the Taiwan question, as well as quit confusing the public and talking nonsense. If the US persists, it will cause severe consequences and pay a heavy price.
Quit confusing the public and talking nonsense. China is not mincing words. It is also unwittingly bringing together American lawmakers, and at prime time, no less. There's a new Congress in place on Capitol Hill. Republicans control the House of Representatives. Democrats have a thin lead in the Senate. There's an important committee in the House of Representatives. It's called the House China Select Committee. This committee focuses on economic and security competition between the US and China. It's more or less the committee that drives US policy vis-a-vis China. On Tuesday, this committee had a session, and China became a punching bag. And China was punched really hard.
There's no doubt that the growing aggression of the Chinese Communist Party poses a generational threat to the United States. From using a spy balloon to surveil some of America's most sensitive military sites, to their theft of upwards of $600 billion of American IP every year, much of which goes into their military, to their continued military aggression and expansion in the Indo-Pacific.
Republicans were more focused on China's ideological, technological, economic and military threat. Democrats made a call for the US to strengthen its democracy and industries. The bottom line is this: there is now bipartisan support for the US to counter China. Almost every congressional leader now recognizes China as a threat to the world and the US. And they want to take concrete action to offset that threat. The Biden administration is taking baby steps to build a global coalition against China. One of the prerequisites for that is for both Democrats and Republicans to be on the same page. For now, they seem to be on one. One can't be so sure of tomorrow, though. Vantage continues after a short break.
We're going to see one is already declared, beg your pardon, and this is 59 and Tripura will be 60. This is a busy morning, ladies and gentlemen, because there is also the G20 summit which is on and it's happening, a lot of activity in the national capital. So we'll go across there because Maria Shakil along with Siddhant and Abhishek Jha will be joining us live with all the activity from there. So we will be hopping, skipping across multiple dimensions of the newscast. But
meanwhile, Beijing has made an outreach to New Delhi. China's new foreign minister is in India. He stood out at today's G20 meeting. Just like the other leaders, Qin Gang got a red carpet reception in New Delhi today. He shook hands with Dr. S. Jaishankar. Later in the day, the leaders met one-on-one. And why is this significant? Because India-China ties have been locked in a diplomatic freeze. After the clashes in Galwan, the dialogue between both sides broke down. In 2020, Chinese troops engaged in an unprovoked attack. It happened in the Galwan Valley in eastern Ladakh. 20 Indian soldiers were killed in action. The India-China relationship hit rock bottom. High-level exchanges came to a virtual halt. Last year, China attempted an outreach. Wang Yi, then China's foreign minister, came to New Delhi. He was given a cold reception. India conveyed its position quite clearly. Until Chinese troops are at the border, the relationship cannot go back to normal. Now China is trying again. Ahead of the minister's arrival, Beijing tried to set the tone. An official statement said that China values its ties with India. Listen to this. China and India are ancient civilizations and both have more than 1 billion people. We are neighbors and are both emerging economies. A sound China-India relationship meets the fundamental interests of both countries and peoples. Well, that's all good. But what about the deadlock at the border? Is there any commitment from China to pull back troops? There isn't. So how should India approach this? As G20 president, should India keep avoiding China or should it engage with China? What should the strategy be? We try to do a SWOT analysis. SWOT is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. SWOT. We're starting with the strengths. China might be the bigger economic power, but there is an opening for India. China is going through some tough times. Its economy has tanked. The Wuhan virus and the wave of infections last year has taken its toll. China has virtually no friends, few that matter. Most have trust issues. Others are upset with China's wolf warrior diplomats. So the friendless dragon is trying to repair ties with the world. At least for now, Beijing appears to be on the back foot. And make no mistake, this is not remorse. This is just a reality check. You see, China's rise was enabled by globalization. But the Ukraine war is killing globalization. It is hurting China's economic recovery. China wants global markets. It wants the current system. And on this front, it could find some synergy with India. So that's the strength. What about the weaknesses? The biggest weakness is China's unpredictability. Like I said, the Communist Party is on the back foot. It's under immense pressure from the West. Recent events, like the spy balloon saga, have added to the tensions. The US and China are butting heads, and this can lead to more Chinese adventurism. And that will make any conversation with China more complicated for India. Third, the opportunities. India wants to revitalize the G20, make it work for the developing world. China seems to be on board with that idea. Consider what the Chinese foreign minister said today. Allow me to quote, "The G20 is the premier forum for international economic cooperation. Faced with a volatile international situation and rising global challenges, the G20 must rise to the occasion, enhance cooperation, and contribute its share to global development and prosperity. We need to make global development more inclusive, resilient, and beneficial for all." It's a bit rich coming from China. But compare the statement with what India's Prime Minister said today.
We must all acknowledge that multilateralism is in crisis today. The experience of the last few years, financial crisis, climate change, pandemic, terrorism, and wars, clearly shows that global governance has failed in both its mandates. We must also admit that the tragic consequences of this failure are being faced most of all by the developing countries.
So there are clear synergies, but there are clearer challenges. Besides tensions at the border, China is trying to pursue its own agenda at the G20. At the summit today, it pushed for Xi Jinping's Global Security Initiative. What's that? It's an idea that China revealed last year. A global security initiative. Basically, it is aimed at challenging America's military partnerships. China wants to dictate the rules of engagement in the Indo-Pacific. That is the larger plan. The specifics are not yet clear, but India sees it as a direct challenge to its own security interests. So as of today, the threats outweigh the opportunities. India should err on the side of caution. Yes, talking is any day preferable to fighting. But remember, China only understands the language of strength. So keep working on the defenses. Back in China, the debt bubble is about to burst. As we speak, a crisis is spiraling. Chinese provinces are on the verge of default. Their borrowings are extremely high and they're not being able to pay back. I have some numbers. China has 31 provinces. 17 of them face a debt crisis. Their outstanding loans are well over 120% of their incomes. What does that mean? Simply put, their loan piles are bigger than their income. At least 120% more. So the risk of default is quite high. And it's not just one or two provinces. More than 50% of China's provinces are in crisis. They face a financial crunch. But how did they end up here? By wasteful spending. It's all linked to China's infrastructure boom. When the times were good, these provinces tried to ride the wave. They launched several infrastructure projects. They came up with fancy ways to raise money. They were called local government financing vehicles, LGFVs, local government financing vehicles. What were these? Basically, these were companies to raise cash. They issued bonds. These companies were backed by a local government. And that money then was pumped into infrastructure projects. But why do you need such companies at all? Can local governments not borrow directly? Well, they can, but there are certain restrictions. But if governments go through a firm or an LGFV, there is no restriction on borrowing. So the local governments kept taking out loans, they kept borrowing more and more money, and now the bill is due. How much do these local governments owe? China has never been transparent with numbers, so answering this question is a bit tricky, but we do have some estimates. These companies, LGFVs, have issued bonds to the tune of $2 trillion. That's 40% of China's corporate bond market, $2 trillion. Another report throws up different numbers. It says the local government debt is much higher than $2 trillion. How much higher? A whopping $5 trillion at the end of 2022. Experts say these LGFVs have borrowed off the books too, meaning some of the loans will not show up on their balance sheets. And of course, not all of these loans will be in distress. But remember, more than 50% of the provinces in China are short of cash, so a large chunk of the loans could go bad, and that would be embarrassing for China. Because companies defaulting on loans is one thing, but default by a government is another ballgame altogether. That would put Chinese provinces in the league of Sri Lanka and Pakistan, governments going broke. Both these countries, Sri Lanka and Pakistan, are seeking a bailout from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and both countries are imploding. In Sri Lanka, the debt crisis led to a government's collapse. There was an alarming shortage of essentials. Pakistan is headed in the same direction, and now China is showing signs of stress. Let me tell you what local reports say. Some local governments in China cannot pay their bills anymore. In Shenzhen, for instance, salaries of teachers have been cut. In Dalian and Wuhan, there have been protests. Pensioners took to the streets here. Why? Because their health insurance was slashed by the government. Beijing will have to step in. And next week is going to be critical. The Chinese parliament is set to meet. This is an annual affair. It happens every year. The entire Communist Party leadership will be present. But will they agree to a bailout? Will Beijing bail out local governments in China? So far, it has been reluctant. Earlier, the Chinese Finance Ministry had issued a statement. It had a message for local governments. This is what it said. Listen to this. If it's your baby, you should hold it yourself. The central government won't bail you out. That was the message from Beijing. But now this crisis is reaching epic proportions. Governments in more than half of China's provinces are running out of cash. And this is not a headline that China would like to see. Also, without a bailout, there could be more protests and market chaos. China's economy is already faltering. Whatever the Communist Party decides, it is now being confronted with a harsh reality. China's prestige as an economic power is on the line. Do you remember the Havana syndrome? A mysterious ailment that broke out about 7 years ago in the Cuban capital, Havana. It made American diplomats sick. More than 1,000 cases are said to have been reported. Among the victims were top US military officials and diplomats. And while there were still questions over its origins, the Americans decided to spice up the game. They came up with some good old conspiracy theories. They said the syndrome was deliberately unleashed on them by rivals like the Russians. Almost like some sort of new warfare tactics. And no, this is not some movie plot. Now, as it turns out, the foreign adversary claim does not hold water. Embarrassingly, Washington itself had to do the cleanup. An intelligence report has officially debunked the claim. It says there is no foreign hand in the Havana syndrome. Here's more. The year was 2016. Around 16 people in the US Embassy in Cuba's capital, Havana, suddenly fell ill. All of them reported common symptoms, like headache and nausea. Washington raised alarm bells. It claimed that a foreign adversary's hand could not be ruled out. This outbreak came to be known as the Havana syndrome. 7 years after the initial batch of cases, the US has admitted that there was no foreign hand whatsoever. The Director of National Intelligence said, and I quote, "I can share with you that most intelligence agencies have now concluded that it is very unlikely a foreign adversary responsible for the reported AHI, or Havana syndrome. Since 2016, the Havana syndrome is said to have affected more than 1,000 US diplomats and military officials across the globe. All patients affected reported common symptoms like headache, nausea, vertigo, and memory loss. Many complained of hearing strange sounds like grinding metal, even when there was actually no sound around.
You won't be hearing it, but of course it is going into your system. It's like a acoustic hammer which is hitting you. You're just not able to hear it because its frequency is much higher. So there were some concerns to it.
Subsequently, such cases have been reported among US diplomats and intelligence personnel in Russia, Poland, Serbia, Colombia, France, and Vietnam, to name a few. Washington called them anomalous health incidents, and there was a lot of attention given to this. Take, for instance, Vice President Kamala Harris. She made an infamous visit to Vietnam in 2021. Her trip from Singapore to Vietnam was delayed by several hours. That's after 2 cases of the Havana syndrome were suspected. No details were provided on what exactly happened, but Harris eventually made the trip and spoke about it.
I will tell you that we're looking into it, and I'm not able to share much more at this time, but on your point about embassy staff, I met with them today and then also saw them yesterday during the lease signing ceremony. And I will tell you that the people who work in our embassies, be it here in Mission Vietnam or around the globe, are some of the most courageous and selfless public servants that you can meet. I talked with them extensively about the importance of their work and also a recognition of the sacrifice they make.
The origins aren't clear yet. Guesses of what it could be flew thick and fast. Some called it a mass psychogenic illness. Others dubbed it as a foreign conspiracy. The CIA, in a 2022 report, rubbished all claims. It studied more than 1,000 patients and came to the conclusion that while there was some ambiguity, the syndrome is highly unlikely to be unleashed by rivals like Russia. It even called them some of the toughest cases for the agency.
The findings that the intelligence community has spoken to today in no way call into question the experiences, the symptoms that our colleagues and their family members have reported in recent years.
So was the Havana syndrome real? The patients say it was. Washington agrees that their diplomats suffered strange health conditions. But the fact is, there is no proof of how it happened and who was behind it. Meanwhile, in Israel, it was the day of disruption, and quite literally, the streets of Israel were packed. Chaotic scenes of protesters clashing with the police have gone viral. The parliament, meanwhile, was in a huddle, looking to tighten the screws on the judiciary. First, Israeli legislators passed a reform that gave them a greater say in appointing judges. That decision is being met with fierce opposition on the streets. And now the parliament is laying the foundation for a fresh push for the death penalty. Death penalty for whom? Terrorists who kill Israeli citizens. The proposal passed a preliminary vote on Wednesday, with the support of 55 lawmakers, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Many from the opposition walked out. It will now have to be passed in the next 3 voting sessions to become a law.
I state that the proposal of the penal law amendment of death penalty for terrorists by member of Knesset Linor's son Har Melesh has been accepted and will move to be prepared for the first reading in the Committee of Constitution, Law and Justice.
So what does the proposed law say? Israel wants nothing less than the death penalty for those who attack Israeli citizens. In fact, I have a copy of the bill. This is what it says. Someone who intentionally or out of indifference causes the death of an Israeli citizen when the act is carried out from a racist motive or hate to a certain public and with the purpose of harming the state of Israel and the rebirth of the Jewish people in its homeland will be awarded the death penalty. Reports say the law will extend to the West Bank too. The courts in this region will have to award the capital punishment if all judges don't reach a consensus. But why is Israel pushing for this now? It says the legislation will curb terrorism. You see, capital punishment is already a part of Israel's criminal code. This is not technically new. But the death penalty has been used in extremely rare cases. Sample this. In 75 years, only 2 people have been executed by the state. One of them was ex-Nazi Adolf Eichmann. But Israeli governments in recent years have looked to change that. And these efforts fizzled out for 2 reasons. One, due to lack of political support, and the second, the legal aspect. Top legal experts say that the death penalty cannot be the deterrent to stop terrorists. Which brings us to the question, why is Israel keen to bring back the law now? Remember, tensions have been escalating in the West Bank. Earlier this week, an Israeli military raid in Nablus left 11 Palestinians dead. Last month, Israeli forces carried out one of the deadliest military raids in recent years. Many see the new proposal as Israel's way of going after the people it calls terrorists. And that's expected to raise tensions further. The world is calling for de-escalation. Germany says the death penalty goes against the rule of law.
Ich will nicht verhehlen, dass wir uns im Ausland Sorgen machen.
I will not hide the fact that we abroad are concerned about some legislative projects in Israel. One of the values that unites us is the protection of the rule of law, such as the independence of the judiciary. This has always been a hallmark of Israel. We are particularly concerned about the plan to introduce the death penalty. We are firmly opposed to it, and we speak out about this all over the world.
Die Todesstrafe einzuführen. Wir sind aus fester Überzeugung gegen die Todesstrafe und wir sprechen das überall auf der Welt an.
Firmly opposed to the death penalty. The mood is no different at home. Israelis have been out on the streets for weeks now. They're protesting against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's judicial overhaul. On Wednesday, the country signed a National Disruption Day. And it did see disruptions. Tel Aviv witnessed dramatic scenes. Israeli police reportedly fired stun grenades and dragged protesters off the roads. These scenes are said to be unprecedented in the capital. Protesters say this is a fight against what they call Netanyahu's dictatorship.
I fought for 30 years in this country to save this country. Now I'm fighting against the dictatorship that's going to happen here. I won't let it happen. I want that to happen.
Clearly, Prime Minister Netanyahu has his hands full. Large-scale protests are expected to escalate in Israel. The Prime Minister is determined to undertake reforms. The death penalty is just the latest in the act. And now let's turn to the UK. 4 million children are going hungry in Britain. They're suffering what's called food insecurity. They're skipping meals or not eating for a whole day. This is twice the number of children compared to just a year ago. And this is thanks to Britain's cost of living crisis. It is hurting the poor the most. Food inflation was over 17% last month. That's the highest level ever recorded in the UK. There's a serious shortage of fresh vegetables. Headlines talk about a salad crisis and a pizza crisis, which may make it sound less severe than it is. A record number of people are surviving on food banks. London plans to start something like India's midday meal scheme. But what about the rest of the country? What is the UK government doing to tackle this hunger crisis? Our next report has the details.
More British children are going hungry than ever before. 4 million children are experiencing food insecurity. They come from the UK's poorest households where people are skipping meals to make ends meet. A new report says that about 22% of UK households faced food insecurity in January. This is up from 12% a year ago, almost double. The numbers are even worse for households with children. About a quarter of these face food insecurity. But why are British children starving? The simple answer is the cost of living crisis. The war in Ukraine has caused the prices of essentials like food and energy to go up. Wages haven't increased proportionally, so people have been cutting down on food to make ends meet. They try and limit their intake to feed their children.
Possibly I wouldn't be eating tonight. My children would be able to eat, but I wouldn't be able to eat, and maybe I won't be able to eat for a few days because the food that I'd put on my plate, I'd be putting on my kids' plate instead, because I'd rather them eat, because they've got school and they've got their futures ahead of them.
But sometimes, even that isn't enough. There's also the recent fresh food shortage. Supermarkets are rationing vegetables due to a shortage in supplies. London blames the shortage on adverse weather in southern Europe, but Europe says it is suffering no shortages. In the UK, prices of fruits and vegetables have gone up, so people have had to cut down on healthy food and are buying junk instead. The cost of a nutritious meal has gone up.
To be honest, I'm going for the cheapest goods at the moment because of the inflation and the cost of living. But yeah, it's very scary. Let's hope it gets put right quite soon.
And what's the government doing to feed British children? Nothing new yet. Last year, they extended a scheme to provide free breakfast to some school children. But civil society groups are pushing for universal free school meals. This means all school children should be provided with free meals at school, something like India's midday meal scheme. London's Mayor Sadiq Khan plans to roll out free meals to all primary school students. It's scheduled to start from September. It's a one-year emergency measure to address the crisis. Scotland and Wales are planning the same. But all these measures will take time, and the number of hungry children is rising steadily. Unless prices fall and food supplies increase, the UK government is staring at a malnutrition epidemic.
This year was expected to be a buzzy one for artificial intelligence. 2 months in, it has delivered. Companies are racing to create the next big hit. But it's not just companies. Governments too are part of this race. And Romania has unveiled something worth boasting about. Their government has a new member. And it's completely run on AI, artificial intelligence. It's an AI assistant named Ion. It's being called an honorary advisor to the Prime Minister. AI is the new superpower, and the Romanian government just got its own Jarvis. You know, Iron Man's AI assistant, Jarvis. But jokes apart, the AI gold rush is here. What does this mean for the world? Our next report tells you.
Romania's Prime Minister, Nicolae Ciucă, presented the newest member of his entourage, his new honorary advisor. It's an artificial intelligence assistant named Ion. Ciucă says it's the first of its type. It's a mirror-like structure with a beeping interface. How will it be used? Its main task is to scan social networks and use data publicly available on these platforms. It will then draw up reports on the citizens' priorities and inform the Romanian government of the citizens' wishes and proposals. In other words, it will tell the government what people are thinking in real time. Ciucă said that the use of AI should not be an option. He called it an obligation to make better informed decisions. And he's not the only one hailing the use of AI assistants. The number of people using conversational AI tools, especially voice assistants, is increasing. But first things first, what's a voice assistant? It's a software that responds to voice commands. It can run tasks on many devices, like smartphones, speakers, laptops, and even cars. Amazon's Alexa, Apple's Siri, and Google Assistant are some examples. We can use them to turn on the lights or set a timer. We can even use them as speakers for podcasts. They can even tell us if it's about to rain or if it's time to reorder grocery. The number of people using them has been creeping up. It's estimated that this year, the number of voice assistants will match the global population, around 8 billion, and they have billions of interactions every week. But while our engagement with these assistants continues to increase, are we falling out of love with them? Over the past few years, they have had a slower adoption rate. Adult user base rose by around 12% in 2020, and then only about 3% in 2021. According to internal Amazon data, after 2 weeks of activating Alexa, 15 to 25% of the users drop off. Why is this happening? Privacy is a major concern. Many are worried about conversation data. They don't know how much or where it is stored. Maybe in a cloud somewhere, who knows? In a survey, 82% of the people said they're worried about this. Many are also concerned about bias and data tracking, and some incidents have reinforced these fears. Remember when Alexa sent 1,700 voice recordings to the wrong person? This included audio from the shower. And how Amazon, Apple, and Google staff listen to private conversations? Several other high-profile instances have further eroded trust. People heard creepy laughs from their Alexa as they were trying to sleep. Another time, Alexa asked a young girl to touch a penny to a live plug socket. Voice assistants have been creepy, racist, and dangerous. And companies are aggressively working on improving the tech. But they are simultaneously making cuts because of this downfall. Amazon is cutting 18,000 jobs. 2,000 of these developed its Alexa and smart speakers.
Why are coffee beans such troublemakers? They always end up in hot water.
Google is also scaling back the development of its assistant. Customers are not opposed to embracing AI, but it will happen when these concerns are addressed. Firms developing this tech and clients using it need to be more transparent. And AI is getting more guardrails. The EU is creating the world's first standards to regulate it. Companies developing this tech are also at the center of lawsuits, like Microsoft's GitHub. But it can be a while before these changes are seen. So if you have concerns, read the privacy policy on your phone or on the websites of Apple, Google, Samsung and others. Opt out of features that make you uncomfortable. But flaws aside, we can expect AI companies to improve on strengths. A decade ago, AI was more likely to prop up in dystopian movies. A lot has changed since then. It's now a part of our daily lives. But every time we struggle to manually switch off the lights, know that AI is struggling too, only with growing skepticism.
And finally, it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story, starting with New York. Firefighters were battling a massive fire in Buffalo. An explosion knocked them to the ground. The moment was captured on camera. A SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket blasted off for the International Space Station. It has 2 astronauts from NASA, 1 Russian and 1 Emirati. Space seems to be the only areas, or one of the only areas of cooperation left between the US and Russia. In Peru, a mummy was found in the cooler bag of a delivery man. He used to deliver food. He's been detained. He calls the mummy his spiritual girlfriend. And in China, a panda was caught on camera drinking water in a snow-covered field. We're leaving you with these images. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.
Engines full power, and liftoff. Cruise pitch. Go Dragon, go Falcon.
Now launching on Endeavour's first flight to the International Space Station. Vehicles pitching downrange. Was traveling faster than the speed of sound. On his ride uphill. 1 minute 53 seconds into flight.
Attempting to land on our drone ship, just read the instructions.
You should rather just follow it instead of criticizing it, because some of your leaders back in the day used to say that Supreme Court is infallible. What happened to that? Stop contradicting yourself. Number 2, it's a welcome step. It's a great step. We appreciate it, commend it. And the Bharatiya Janata Party clearly did not want it to happen. They filed a counter affidavit. Back in the day also, when we demanded it, fought for it, they always used to oppose it and did that vociferously. And not just that, we really hope that the letter and spirit of this would also be understood by the Bharatiya Janata Party and implemented for the other institutions. And we would also hope that for the Enforcement Directorate, a similar mechanism is adopted. Why? Because the number of raids and the number of cases are too high. There's a massive gap in the number of cases and in the conviction rate. So if we have a better mechanism like the one for CEC and the EC probably we
So can I ask one question? Can I ask one question? Now, the judiciary, fair enough, the judiciary has pronounced this judgment and no one is disrespecting it, of course. This now becomes the law until otherwise the parliament passes a law to replace this one or strengthen this one. But what about the opposite should also be true? If the judiciary or the chief judicial officer of the country, the Chief Justice of India, has a seat on the table to decide the Chief Election Commissioner, why shouldn't the executive have a seat on the table to decide judges? The corollary should hold just as true.
See, let's understand one thing. The executive has basically some unofficial coalition partners that everybody knows of. And not just that, I gave a very good example of the Enforcement Directorate that there is a massive gap in raids and the number of convictions that are happening. These kind of things are to be taken care of. And who ensures justice in India? It is the Supreme Court. It is the Constitution. That is the law of the land. It is the Supreme Court that safeguards it.
No.
So let's
all of that point well taken. I'll ask Ishkaran this. I think, if you were to take an apples to apples comparison, if the judiciary says in the interest of transparency, we need to be, or at least one of our members needs to be part of the committee that decides who's going to be the Chief Election Commissioner, then why can't the executive turn around and say that we need to have one representative in the interest of transparency and fairness on the appointment of judges?
Hello and welcome to the Late Night Edition with me, Ayushman Singh Jamwal. It is a saffron storm in the Northeast, ladies and gentlemen, where the BJP-led Northeast Democratic Alliance has once again shown the electoral power of brand Modi and the Vikas drive that has touched every corner of the region, from a development revamp to establishing peace and stability. It is a clean sweep for the BJP in Tripura as it secures a second term and a landslide victory for the NDPP-BJP alliance in Nagaland that has decimated the opposition. All eyes are on Meghalaya given the alliance buzz. Now, Assam Chief Minister Himanta Biswa Sarma has tweeted that Conrad Sangma had in fact called Amit Shah and sought his support to form the government. But looking at the bigger picture, on the road to 2024, has the BJP established the Northeast as a bastion where just 7 years back it had not one government? Is this another electoral endorsement of the Prime Minister's Vikas brand and namely his Act East agenda? Most importantly, what is the opposition's next move after another electoral debacle? Now let's listen in to Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who gave that victory speech at the BJP headquarters. But first, here is the election action that took place in the Northeast.
The Northeast is often referred to as a political bellwether for the unique relationship it shares with the Union. Elections in the Northeast makes any dip in the fortunes of the ruling party at the centre extremely significant. The results in Tripura, Nagaland and Meghalaya will provide telling pointers on the sustainability of deeper shifts in India's policy. In Tripura, the BJP-led alliance is set to retain power against combined forces of the left parties and Congress. Voting the challenge from Tipra Motha, which initially threatened to keep BJP off majority mark.
Thank you very much for your this congratulation. And of course, I am very happy. Our party peoples are very happy. And first of all, I want to thank our Honorable Prime Minister, our Honorable Home Minister, our National President JP Nadda ji.
गुबागरा ने क्लियरली चुनाव से पहले भी कहा है, अगर हम नहीं जीत पाते तो हम लोग सरकार में तो नहीं जाएंगे, लेकिन विपक्ष में ही बैठेंगे.
Last time, Nagaland had a unique feature of having no opposition. All parties with a presence in the 16-member assembly backed the Nationalist Democratic Party-led government. NDPP-BJP alliance contested these polls with a 40-20 formula, and the four-time Chief Minister looks set for a fifth term.
जो इंक्लूसिव डेवलपमेंट मोदी सरकार ने डबल इंजन सरकार नागालैंड और दिल्ली मिला के दिया है, उससे हम लोग प्रचंड आवाज से हम लोग जीत के आएंगे.
हम मानते हैं कि नागालैंड में विकास को लेके एक ये ऐतिहासिक सरकार रहेगी.
In Meghalaya, BJP contested on all 60 seats for the first time and ran determined campaigns with its big wigs. BJP was a partner in the state government, but ties soured. However, Chief Minister Conrad Sangma has hinted that the two parties can again come together if the verdict throws up a hung assembly.
Looks like we are short, but we'll wait for the final results. But let's hope for the best, and once the final numbers are out, then we'll take a call.
These elections have shown the mirror to many. The Congress relegated to the fringes and the TMC unable to make mark outside of Bengal. And over the past 8 years, the Bharatiya Janata Party has gradually replaced the grand old Congress Party to become a force to reckon with in the northeast region.
आज के नतीजे ये दिखाते हैं कि भारत में लोकतंत्र और लोकतांत्रिक व्यवस्थाओं पर कितनी आस्था है, एक मजबूत आशावाद है। अब नॉर्थ ईस्ट न दिल्ली से दूर है और न ही दिल से दूर है। हमने सबका साथ, सबका विकास, सबका विश्वास और सबका प्रयास एक नया विकास मॉडल देश को दिया है। साथियों, मैं ज्यादा तो टीवी देख नहीं पाता हूं, लेकिन मुझे लगता है कि शायद अब तक मैंने देखा नहीं है कि ईवीएम पर कोई गाली पड़नी शुरू हुई है कि नहीं हुई है। भाजपा के विजय अभियान का रहस्य छिपा है त्रिवेणी में। इस त्रिवेणी की पहली शक्ति है भाजपा सरकारों